All right, your second handout, page 7, which you have from last week or you picked up at the appointed place this morning. Parties, sects, that's groups, and beliefs of the Jews. And we're going to go through this at the speed of light. That's why your notes are fairly complete. You got lots of words here to take home and read. So let's talk about some of these groups. These are the groups and the things that we encounter in the Gospels that seem new. When we come from the Old Testament into the Gospels, we read about Sadducees and scribes, Sanhedrins, Herods, Herodians. None of these people have existed in the Bible up to this point. There are other weird things that are going on. For instance, Jesus selects his disciples from fishermen instead of shepherds. There are no shepherds in the New Testament. There are no fishermen in the Old Testament. All the prophets were shepherds. The kings were shepherds. The priests were shepherds in that they were dealing with sheep. New Testament is all fish. What's going on? Well, we're moving from the Jew to the Gentile, you see. We're moving into a different symbolic situation. We have all these groups, so who are they? And which ones are the most important? Well, by far the most important are the Pharisees, because Jesus was a Pharisee of some sort. And that's what we're going to spend most of our brief time this morning on. But just quickly then, the first group that we encounter or that we should say something about are the Sadducees. You know, we always think, Sadducees and Pharisees. But when you actually read the Gospels, the Sadducees almost never appear. They're only mentioned a few times. They're not that important. They are important, but they're not important in the way the Pharisees are in their predominance in the Gospels. Who are they? Well, basically, they are the aristocratic class in Jerusalem. Okay? In any society, big city culture is not the same as small town culture. New York City is not part of the United States, is it? Neither is Los Angeles. I mean, these are big cities. They think different, they dress different, and they look down their nose at everybody else. That's the way it is. Big city life and culture takes on a completely different cast from town and countryside culture. We had a whole Puritan movement, which was in some ways, not always, a reaction of the countryside against city-type cathedral worship practices, the kind of things you do in a city that seem very strange to people out in the countryside. There was a lot more to it than that, but that's always a dynamic that's going on. And the Sadducees were aristocratic priestly caste in the city of Jerusalem. That's pretty much where they were. Most of the priests were Sadducees. That's important to the gospel because it's the priests who have Jesus put to death. It's not the Romans, it's not the Jews. It is specifically the priests who head it all up and who organize it and push it through. That's theologically very important. See, the priests are closest to God, and they're the ones who hate God the most when push comes to shove. What kinds of things did they believe? Well, actually, they were very conservative. In some ways, they're the descendants of the Hellenizers from 200 years before this time. In other ways, they're not. They accepted only the first 5 books of the Bible, what the Jews call the Torah. And they viewed the rest of the scriptures, which the Jews call what? Do you know what the Jews call the rest of the Bible? It's called the Tanakh. Big deal, right? Well, all right. They accepted only the first 5 books as absolutely inspired, and the rest of the scriptures were secondary. Interesting, but hey, they're not as authoritative. They did not have any interest in the developing oral law of the Pharisees, and because they had such an incomplete Bible, they have to fill it out with something. They tended to fill it out with philosophical ideas. We know they didn't believe in a physical resurrection, and they stressed temple activity. But in fact, we really don't know all that much about the Sadducees. They didn't leave behind much literature. What we do know is that they are the aristocratic priestly party centered in Jerusalem. Next group of people are scribes or lawyers. That's the same group of people. Scribes. A lawyer came to Jesus. A scribe said to Jesus, the teachers of the law. That's the same group of people. Who are they? Well, they're people who can read and write. And as a result of that, they are a class of people who are experts in the scriptures and the law, and they are teachers of it in various settings. These are the kinds of people who can write a contract for you. You need to make a deal with somebody else, they'll write the contract. They know how to write it up. They know how to make it conform to the biblical law. Okay? Make sure it's written the right way. So they're experts. We see mention of Ezra the scribe in Nehemiah 8 and 9. They sort of the new kind of Levites. You had Levites who were teachers in Israel. Then later on you had the schools of the prophets who were teachers in Israel during the kingdom time. And now in this time that is taken up by people who are scribes. They don't have to be Levites. They don't have to be of any particular tribe. But they are doing the same kind of things. So they're the ones who really set up the synagogues as schools of the Scriptures. And synagogues were like 4 or 5 hour Sunday school every Saturday. That's what they were like. That's what you did. Study. Get the Scripture down. They were not liturgical worship services. They never had anything like a sacrament or a meal. Not much singing. All that goes on at the temple. That's why the church is the temple instead of the synagogue. Because what we do here is covenant renewal. We have bread and wine. We sing. Sunday school is synagogue. Worship is temple. What's a rabbi? Well, a rabbi is a super scribe. The scribes love to be called rabbis, says Jesus. Why? Because rabbi means great one or master. Rab means great. So you read the Old Testament about people like Rabshakeh and names like that. That Rab there means great. Okay? So rabbis are called masters. Jesus is called master because he's a great teacher. Okay? Like me. A great teacher. Some are rabbis and some are just scribes, you know. Just kidding now, but Jesus is not just a teacher, a scribe, but he's a great scribe. He's a rabbi. That's what rabbis are. These people are not in some guild. They probably were in something like a guild. They didn't necessarily have official positions. They were just people who are recognized as good teachers, all right? So-and-so is a good teacher. We'll go out and hear him. He's given some lectures this weekend. What's the Sanhedrin? The word Sanhedrin means tribunal. And these are councils of judges. And every town had its Sanhedrin of a few elders and maybe some of the clergy to get together and make decisions. Back in Deuteronomy, this was set up. It says that the elders will meet with the local Levites to pass judgment on things when things come up. That just carries down into this time in things called Sanhedrins. You didn't have Levites anymore, but you did have religious experts and local judges, and when they met together, that was called a Sanhedrin. In Israel, mainly this was to decide on religious disputes, but they had some civil authority as well in their local areas. The great Sanhedrin was, of course, in Jerusalem, and it consisted of 70 people. Now, when you read in the New Testament about the Sanhedrin meets, it's always the great Sanhedrin. It's the Jerusalem Sanhedrin. It was over all the Jews, and it was mostly Sadducees and scribes. Okay? Again, this is your aristocracy. This is your scribe. This is your Jerusalem aristocratic, priestly group of people. Some Pharisees, some others, okay? But mostly dominated by Jerusalem aristocracy consisting of Sadducees and scribes. Who were the Herods? We've mentioned them before, but just quickly to review. Herods were a powerful clan of Edomites. They had been circumcised, conquered and circumcised about 3 generations earlier, and so by now they were Jews. After 3 generations, an Edomite is a Jew if he's circumcised. So these Herods were. The Romans put them in power, and they had a large extended family. Like I say, they were a clan. There were scores of Herods running things all over this part of the world. Idumea, Galilee, Samaria, Judea, Etruria, all these areas right around here. There were Herods here and Herods there. Herods in charge of towns, Herods in charge of trade, Herods as tax collectors, Herods making money off of people here, there, and everywhere and running their lives. And up at the top were the King Herods. Okay? So they kind of control political affairs in Jewry. And when they were in power, and this would go back and forth during this time of history, but when the Herods were in power, they were kind of a buffer between Rome and Israel. The Romans dealt with the Herods dealt with the people under them. Because the Herods were circumcised Jews, the Jews were happier dealing with Herods than dealing with Romans. And so that is why you find a group of people called Herodians. These are the people that favored Herodian rule over Roman rule. They were kind of a political party that was always saying more of Herod, less of Caesar. Okay? We only see him show up a couple of times. They didn't usually get along with the Pharisees, but you see that they get together with the Pharisees to ask Jesus a significant question. Is it okay to pay tax to Caesar? They're both interested in that question. The Pharisees are interested in the question because taxation involves interest on charity, usury, and that was wrong. So it's sinful to do that. The Herodians wanted to know if it's okay to pay tax to Caesar because they wanted to know which side of this Jesus is on. Hey, are you for Herod or are you for Caesar? It's important to understand that in the Gospels, Jesus presents himself as the true king, the true heir of David, and this is pointed against Herod. The Herods were supposedly the new Davidic kings over Israel, and when Jesus claims to be the king, this is mainly against Herod. That's why when Jesus comes into Jerusalem and they say, "Hail, King of the Jews," that doesn't bother Pilate, not to start with. It bothers Herod. The people are unhappy with Herod because Herod had put John the Baptist to death. And so now Jesus is coming along, and maybe this is a good replacement. That's the political unrest that's behind Palm Sunday. But when he's called King of the Jews, Herod is, if word gets to Pilate, some guy came into town there saying he's King of the Jews. Well, we know that Pilate didn't like Herod anyway, did he? They became friends after Jesus was put to death. So Pilate is probably thinking, good, we'll kick old Herod out and we'll make this guy King of the Jews. Of course, as the week goes by, things get worse and worse, and then the priests come and they say, kill this guy. Pilate says, if I put this man to death, this city might blow up. I can't do that. But they finally force him to, remember, by threatening to call Caesar on the phone and get Pilate's job lost for him. But in the Gospels, it's Jesus and Herod. Who's the true Davidic king? That's secondary to the question who is the true priest, and that's why it's mainly the priests that wind up putting Jesus to death, priests and Pharisees. We'll go on with that. Who were the Zealots? Well, I've always had the impression that the Zealot party was a group of people who want to throw out Rome, and that they're operating all the time in the Gospels, and that Simon the Zealot, one of the disciples, is one of these Zealot guys. Well, I have found out that that's just not likely to be true. The Zealots showed up when the Romans became very oppressive, and there was a rebellion against Rome in 6 A.D., which I've given you here in your notes. I'm not going to read all that. But as long as things were relatively calm, and as long as you had Herod's ruling things, there apparently was no Zealot party, and there was no stirring of rebellion. In AD 44, after Agrippa died, that's recorded for us in Acts 11 and 12, he puts James to death, and Peter gets out of prison, and then Herod Agrippa receives worship as a god, and then he dies. In AD 44, the Romans took over again from the Herods. And then you had a Zealot party start to show up, and increasingly movements to rebel against Rome. But during the Gospel period, apparently you really didn't have this going on. And Simon the Zealot just means Simon the enthusiast. Okay? He was the charismatic among the disciples. It apparently does not mean Simon the member of the Zealot party. I suppose maybe scholars debate that, but from what I can tell, that's pretty much the consensus now. We're not talking about political revolutionaries very much during Jesus' day. Well, what about tax collectors? When you read about tax collectors and publicans, who are that? Well, these are tax farmers. If you want to make some money, you go to the ruler and you say, I'll give you so much percentage if you'll let me be the tax farmer, and I'll go out here and farm taxes out of all these people, and I'll collect them. And, of course, what you do is you collect it plus interest, and you give some of it over to the guy that you leased out the right to gather taxes from. You keep some extra for yourself, and it's an abusive situation, okay? So tax collectors are tax farmers who gather taxes for Herods and sometimes for Romans. Mainly they're gathering taxes for the Herods, and the Herods turned them on over to the Romans, okay? It was kind of a graduated stair-step thing. The people didn't like them, but it was not because they worked for the Herods and the Romans, but because they so often abused their position and cheated the people. They charged interest. Deuteronomy says you may never charge interest on a non-business loan, on a charity loan. Interest on a business investment is fine, but interest on a charity loan is forbidden. Tax farmers would do that, and so the Pharisees, being strict for the law, regarded the tax collectors as sinners. They are like prostitutes. They are like the worst scum, thieves. They're down there. They're outside of those who are regarded as at least partly faithful. These people aren't faithful at all because they charge interest. And that's true enough. I mean, it is forbidden to loan money to somebody to help them out in need and then charge interest to them for it. Who were sinners? You read in the Gospels about the sinners. That's a group of people, and it's that group of people. It's the group of people who just don't seem to care about religion. Okay? Some people say, well, the sinners were anybody who didn't measure up to the super spiritual standards of the Pharisees. No, that's not really true. The sinners are people who just don't care. They don't go to synagogue. They're drunkards. They divorce and remarry over and over again. They're prostitutes. They're loose living. They're tax collectors. They're just, they're like unbelievers, okay? They don't go to church. They're sinners. Now we come to the important part. The Pharisees. Who are the Pharisees? Well, we've got down here they came from the Hasidians. Hasidians are the loyal ones. Remember in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes and around that time, these were the people who were loyal to the law, against the Hellenizing aristocratic priests in Jerusalem, and certainly against the Hellenistic powers of the kings. After the usurpation of the high priesthood and kingship by the Hasmoneans, by the Maccabees, which we discussed, they divided into two groups. These loyal ones did. One group just dropped out of society altogether and became the Essenes. They were waiting for God to act. The Pharisees stayed in and witnessed for God. And this is the most important thing about the Pharisees. Unlike the Essenes, they did not abandon the people. Unlike the Sadducees, they didn't sit up in their city as aristocrats. The Pharisees got down into the dirty world and worked with people and tried to help people. The Pharisees are the good guys. And now this is an important point. Their sin was not in bad theology or primarily in bad teaching. Their sin is rejecting Jesus. That's the issue in the Gospels. Jesus did not come to correct people's systematic theology. He came to bring an entirely new world, and that was the issue. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. What do they believe? Well, they downplayed temple activity in favor of individual piety and obedience to God. The temple was kind of corrupt anyway. Besides, we believe in a priesthood of all believers. So everybody should be kind of like a priest, they said. And everybody should be discipling his life, they said. They followed the prophets. To them, the prophets were just as important as the book of Moses. The Tanakh was just as important as the Torah. The prophets has stressed individual personal piety in times when the temple was corrupt. Okay? And they made new applications, which is what you're supposed to do. I mean, you've got to apply the Scripture, and the Pharisees sought to do it. Here are all these common life problems. What does the Bible say? We meditate on it. What shall we say about it? That's what they were trying to do. It became problematic because increasingly they began to see these new applications as if they had been actual revelations from God and were just as authoritative as the Bible. This came to be called the oral law. And they began to think that maybe this oral law had been there all along, given by Moses. And we talked about this last week some. This is only starting up in Jesus' day. It comes full force a generation or two later. But when Jesus talks about the traditions of the fathers, that's what he's talking about. They're already starting to think that their traditions are equal to the Bible in authority. But the main thing they were trying to do was to apply a notion of the priesthood of all believers. They tried to teach the people acts of kindness and charity. This is how you ought to treat one another. Take care of widows and orphans. The Bible says so repeatedly. In Matthew 23, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you go into widows' houses and you devour what they have." That's the corruption of it. But how did they get in those widows' houses in the first place? It's because for a long time, and still I'm sure many of the Pharisees, were known for taking care of widows. It was the bad ones who took advantage of widows. But they were known for that. They also, this seems strange to us, but this is a way of discipleship. They came up with temple-like rituals that people should observe in daily life, like washing of cups and other things. In the temple, part of the discipline was to keep things ceremonially washed and other things would go on. The Pharisees said, okay, out here in the wider temple of the world, we who are a nation of priests, let's come up with some similar discipleship techniques. Whenever you have a cup, be sure you wash it. And remember, that means keep your life clean. And 5 times a day or whatever, be sure you wash your hands and really scrub them with your fist. And remind yourself, that means I need to keep my life clean. I need to really work hard to keep my life clean. Have all these rituals. These are discipleship techniques. That's where they start. Then they start taking on a life of their own. Well, unlike the easy yoke of God's law, these new regulations were too heavy to bear because they wound up with hundreds of them. And the Pharisees often became hypocrites in practice, as they just, who wants to live that way? And they tended to make their own new applications more important than the actual Torah law teaching. Now, I've got some verses down there for you. Jesus says, you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and that's fine. But you ignore the weightier matters. That's not fine. The discipleship techniques themselves became more important than what those techniques were supposed to teach. But once again, remember, they came up with these things with good intentions. By themselves, they weren't necessarily bad. And there were plenty of Pharisees in Jesus' day who continued to have a good heart about these things. The war is with bad Pharisees. So what about Pharisees and Jesus? Number one, true believers tended to be Pharisees. They were out there obeying God, helping other people. Not like Sadducees, not like sinners, not like Essenes. There wasn't a hard boundary between a real Pharisee and others. They kind of faded out into people who were somewhat like Pharisees, but less strictly joined in the club. But this is why Jesus hangs around with them. That's what Jesus is. Okay? Jesus is the super Pharisee. Jesus goes and dines with publicans and sinners. That goes even beyond what the Pharisees were doing in reaching down and trying to help people. He out-Pharisees the Pharisees, you see. That's one of the problems. They say, let's go out and help the poor, and Jesus says, okay, I'll go dine with publicans and sinners. Well, wait a minute, Jesus. That's going too far. Jesus, we see, accepting invitations to dine with Pharisees. That's his milieu. The Pharisees argued about whether to accept Jesus. That's in John 9:16 I have there for you. In other words, Jesus comes on the scene, and the Pharisees are saying, yeah, no. They're the ones who are receptive, and as they receive, they either accept or react. But they can hear it. Okay? Even at the end, when their hostility against him had reached its peak, Jesus still said their teaching was fundamentally right. The scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, listen to what they teach and do what they say, but don't imitate how they act. That means their doctrine and teaching was basically correct. They were hypocrites. They didn't do what they were saying, but their doctrines were basically correct. Now, Jesus did not attack them, but gradually they began to attack him because he claimed to be the Messiah, the bringer of the final age, and because of his claim to be bringing a new law that would supersede the old law. And as we'll see in a minute, they had come to say the law was permanent, and Jesus says, no, it isn't. I'm here to change it, or to transfigure it. Another reason that they attacked him, not only because of this radical claim, but the second was that he differed with them over the applications of the law. He claimed to be a prophet. He claimed that they had missed the mark. He says some of these things that you've dreamed up as discipleship techniques are bad ideas. I've got some better ones. Well, by this time, a lot of them didn't want to hear that. Okay. So that's the Pharisees, at least beginning to think about it. And as Pastor Schneider takes us through Luke this year, we'll meet a lot of Pharisees, and you'll, I'm sure, get this filled out a bit for you. Well, let me give you 3 myths about the Jewish belief at the time of Jesus. There are 3 things that most of us believe, I believed, on and off over the years, that this is what the Jews were believing, and as a matter of fact, these things aren't true. Okay? The first is the belief that the Jews were looking for a Messiah who would set up a new Jewish world empire like the Roman Empire. We want to have a Jewish empire that's like the Roman Empire. We want our feet on everybody else's neck. Okay? I've thought that for years, but that's just not true. Okay? The Jews were looking for a Messiah who would usher in a time of world faithfulness and peace. Nobody's foot would be on anybody's neck. Everybody would be saved. Jew and Gentile, they would all be worshiping the Messiah. They'd all come to Jerusalem, and to the temple where the Messiah would sit, and they would all convert, and they would all be circumcised, and everybody would live happily together. And sure, Rome would be replaced, but it wouldn't be some Jewish Roman Empire. It'd be a time of peace when the lion would lie down with the lamb. That's what they were looking for. The second thing that you sometimes hear and that you sometimes think is that the Jews hated the Gentiles. No, the Jews loved the Gentiles, and they evangelized among them all the time. Jesus says in Matthew 23, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, because you cross land and sea to make one disciple." But actually you're making him a son of Satan, and we'll have to talk about that in a sec if we have time. But, see, they're still very much working at evangelism, and they had been doing so for 2 or 3 centuries. Okay? They wanted the Gentiles saved. What they did wrong was the belief that there were second-class and third-class kinds of believers. Okay? If you really want Yahweh's best, you need to be circumcised. You know, it's okay as a Christian for you to drink, but if you want God's best, you need to take the oath and never let alcohol pass your lips. Okay? If you want Yahweh's best, well, the Lord's best, they weren't saying the word Yahweh anymore, you need to go ahead and be circumcised and become a first-class believer. Actually, after that, if you really want God's best, you need to come on up here and be a Pharisee with us and start doing all the things we do. Okay, so your third-class guys, you're uncircumcised God-fearer. Second class are people who are circumcised. First class are Pharisees. Well, that's wrong. Okay, Gentiles were not supposed to be circumcised in the Old Testament. It would be crazy. What if Jonah had circumcised all of his converts in Nineveh? What would that mean? That would mean that all those people in Nineveh were required to go to Jerusalem every year to Passover. Well, that's not possible. Circumcision is only for the race of Jews who are a nation of priests maintaining the temple. Gentiles were to be believers, but they weren't supposed to come under those ritual laws to do these things. So you have loads of uncircumcised God-fearers in the Old Testament, and you have them in the New Testament as well. But what had gone wrong was the Pharisees having this higher life view that people who are really committed get circumcised and so forth. That's not in the law, and it's a mistake. The third mistake, and this is the most common mistake, is that the Jews or the Pharisees believed in work salvation by keeping the law. They believed that you were supposed to keep the law and earn your way to heaven, and God would reward you by sending you to heaven and giving you the resurrection if you had kept the law because you had earned the merits to do it. That is simply not so. They did not believe that. There's practically no evidence for any such belief. What they believed is the law is God's perfect wisdom for living one's life after you have accepted the free gift of salvation. God has elected you. God has saved you. Trust Him and then do what He says. And if you trust Him and do what He says, you'll wind up in heaven. If you trust Him and do what He says, and after a while you say, no, I don't think I'll do this anymore, I think I'll sin and fall away, then you won't wind up in heaven. But that's basically what they believed. The issue was not the Ordo Salutis. The issue was Jesus, as we'll see. What did the Jews believe about the law? Well, here's where some of the mistakes come in and some of the problems. They believed the Scriptures as God's Word were permanent and unchanging. The Pharisees and Sadducees disagreed on how much of it was an absolutely permanent and unchanging part. For the Sadducees, it was just the first 5 books. For the Pharisees, it was all of it. But it's permanent, it's unchanging. And Jesus came along and said, I'm here to change it. That the law was temporary. The law was for you when you were children. The law points forward to a time when there will be a new and transfigured law. And when Jesus said stuff like that, the Pharisees didn't like it. Okay? What does He do in the Sermon on the Mount? He completely replaces the 5 books of Moses. Let me just quickly show you that, since you're going to get a detailed study of the Sermon on the Mount starting next week. Let me just give you an overview from this perspective, how the Pharisees would have heard it. He starts with the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who are persecuted, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's the beginning of the end. Heaven, heaven. Then you are the salt of the earth. Then you are the light of the world. Heaven, earth, and light. The first day of creation. This is a new creation made up of people. That's what they would have heard. You might not hear that because you don't live in the 5 books of Moses, but they lived there. That's all they had. That's what they studied. Then he says, I'm not going to change the law, but I'm telling you, heaven and earth is going to pass away, and that's going to happen soon. Meanwhile, scribes and Pharisees are fine, but righteousness is coming that has to be better than that. Whoa. Not that they're evil or wrong, but that to enter into the kingdom of heaven, we have to have something even better. Then he surveys the second half of the 10 Commandments, following things in Deuteronomy. Murder, adultery, divorce, which is with thou shalt not steal in Deuteronomy. Pay your vows, that is false oaths, witness bearing. And then don't resist people and give them your cloak, that has to do with coveting. So he republishes the law with different words. Then he talks about giving alms, praying the Lord's Prayer, and fasting. The alms correspond to taking up the contribution to build the tabernacle, which is in the second half of Exodus. Only now it's given to the people. The prayer is the book of Leviticus. Fasting, we're moving into Numbers now. We're in the wilderness. There's not much food out here. Fasting. And so he starts talking about, don't worry about food and drink. Don't worry about your clothing. Because in the book of Numbers, God provided them food. God provided them drink. Their clothes did not wear out. Then he moves in chapter 7 and says, enter through the narrow gate. We're in Deuteronomy here. We're about to come into the promised land. You need to be faithful and go through. Not many find it. Not many did who came out of Egypt. They died in the wilderness. Of course, their children, a vast multitude, did find it. But we're right with Moses saying it's time to enter in to the promised land, go in through the narrow gate. And then finally, he starts talking about the rock. Those who hear these words build on the rock and not on sand. That's all from the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 32, where God is celebrated as the rock over and over again. Now, I'm sure you've read the Sermon on the Mount, and how many of you ever noticed that? That Jesus is touring through Exodus through Deuteronomy. You may not still believe it, but I'm telling you it's right. And the Pharisees would have heard that. And what the Pharisees would have heard is, this guy thinks he's some kind of new Moses who can recast the law. He's not contradicting the law, but he's putting it all out in different terms. He's not changing what it means, but he's doing it all differently. How can you do this? Who do you think you are? Jesus said that the law, as originally given, pointed beyond itself to a future time when it would be fulfilled and transformed into something new. So Jesus agreed with the Pharisees that the law needed new applications, but he said that those new applications could only be seen in and through him. And the Pharisees were sometimes, if not often, making the wrong deductions from the law. So what does that mean? It means that Jesus says the law is not absolutely permanent and unchanging. And I'm here to transform it. Not to contradict it, but to give it a new charge. That was way beyond what they were willing to accept. Now finally, and I've got to go quick here because we need to spend a couple of minutes trying to learn to sing something here, which we will not sing during the worship service. We're just going to start learning it today. So don't panic. Don't panic. What did they believe about salvation? That's the reason I wrote all this out, was so you can go back and review it. The Jews did not believe you earned your way to salvation by merits and good works. I'm sure that there were people who thought that way because that's in the human heart. That's the way we all instinctively think. But that's not what their literature says. That's not what their theologians taught. Their theologians taught they believed in salvation by free grace, which those elected to salvation should embrace by faith and faithfulness. But the issue between Jesus and the Jews and between Paul and the Jews was not over the method of salvation. It was not over the Ordo Salutis. What has happened is theologians, because we labor in doctrine all the time, we want to make everything into a theological issue. Okay. But the issue in the New Testament is not points of theology, it's Jesus. The issue is Jesus. Okay? The issue behind that is, who is God? And this is the bottom line here. The bad Jews had made Satan into their God. They evangelized, but they evangelized for hell. Jesus says that. You cross land and sea, you make your disciples sons of hell. Their synagogues were captained by demons. That's where we find the demons, in the synagogues. Not outside. They had turned the world over to Satan. Satan says to Jesus, this world's been given over to me. Well, who gave it to him? You say, Adam gave it to him. Well, yeah, but God had taken it back from him a lot of times and put the Jews in charge of maintaining. The Jews had given it over to him. Jesus said that they had been elected by Satan, saved by Satan. They were justified by faith in Satan. They were faithfully following Satan. And everything else flowed from the fact that they were of their father, the devil. Jesus doesn't say that to them the first day out of the box, but he gets to where he's saying that to them when it's clear. The issue is not the theory of how you get saved. Faith plus work. Faith and then good works. Faith alone and then good works. They believe that. The question is, what God have you got your faith in? And what God is telling you the works to do? If you have the wrong God, you'll misread the Scriptures and make wrong applications. If you have Satan for your God in your heart, then even though you teach good theology like the Pharisees, in your heart you will be proud and believe in your own good deeds like many of the Pharisees. So you'll be a hypocrite. The teaching was theoretically correct. Wrong God. You know, the situation is mixed until Jesus comes. Any Pharisee you ask would tell you the same thing as any other Pharisee. In their hearts, some were true believers in the Lord and some were sons of Satan. And Jesus exposed the hearts and sorted out Israel. That's what he's doing in the Gospels. He exposes the hearts and sorts them out. Some received him gladly. Some it took time to realize who he was and what his coming meant. Some rejected him instantly but came around later on. Some accepted him and later rejected him. Some rejected him all along. But Jesus was pushing them to see if their hearts were with Yahweh and therefore with Jesus or with Satan. That's the issue. This sorting out process starts again at Pentecost and ends in AD 70. By that time, all Israel had been saved and the rest were destroyed. So that is an important thing to understand. The contest between Jesus and the Pharisees is not over details of theology. It's over him. He's the issue. Who do you trust? You trusting Jesus? Or are you trusting the God of this world, as he's called? Okay. We'll take questions for 30 seconds. And they have to be real questions.
How about the miracles? There's these guys that are always holding the back. Man comes upon them, and they wine, feeds the thousands, raises the dead.
Yeah, it's another sign that he's a prophet because prophets do miracles and Moses did miracles.
Couldn't you imagine Moses? I don't think he did.
Moses turned water to blood.
For these guys to reject something like that?
A lot of these things were done very quietly, though. You read the Gospels. They would raise somebody from the dead and then say, don't tell anybody about it. So, a lot of it's concealed. Okay, we are now going to try to learn to sing something.